Page. If you guys can just say hello and stuff, I don't know. I'm gonna refresh this one.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
How are you, Tim? You ready?
I'm doing all right. Yeah. No. I reread the On Contradiction because I wasn't quite sure what parts we were reading, and then I read the book like 6 months ago or something like that. So
Okay.
I reread some of the smaller bits, but I kind of focused on the last section, which is the critique of Stalin, because I remember that having the most substance to it.
Great. Yeah. Well, we actually want to go through it point by point, so that'll be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just give me a minute.
I'm gonna be sharing the stream around also as we get started, as people start pouring in.
They've changed the format for sharing. It's a little annoying.
Yes, I can't mass share to like 100 groups anymore.
Yeah.
They knew what I was doing, so
yeah. Oh, these guys. Okay, just give us a second then. Get this out there.
And making sure the video is muted on the other tabs.
yeah. Share to a group. Oh my god.
That's a pain, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't even see which ones you've done it to. It's like, dear God.
Okay, there it is in Karl Marx.
Yeah. I gotta share it to China News.
yeah. Oh yeah. Xi Jinping exceptional
There's
president.
that, but there's also China News. I think they kicked me out of one of the China groups. I get tired of this. Okay. So, yeah, we're almost ready to go.
How do I get Xi dollars?
Right.
Chinese yen.
Okay, I'm fine. I think we got a few people here. We got about 13 people here, which is cool. Hey, Andrew Wigan, how's it going?
Hi, Andrew.
So we are here. This is Zero Books Capital Comrades broadcast, and we are here to discuss. Of course, we're doing our reading group of Chinese Marxism, including the work of, a few esoteric, Marxist scholars you might have heard of. Among them, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. And in this part of the group, the first part, we're doing the Verso-published on Practice and Contradiction by Mao Zedong. So the first, the book includes an introduction by Zizek and 12 essays. So we previously read that introduction and the first 4 essays in the book. So today we'll be discussing 5 essays, which seems like a lot, but in truth, the first 4 of those are not very long. It's only the 5th that really has too much meat on it. But I think they all potentially interesting for you guys. And crucial here, I think, to our discussion will be Mao's critique of the 1951 work by Joseph Stalin. By Joseph Stalin. You can't see me here because of the 3, but I'm making quotation marks with my with my hands.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna go like this.
But by Joseph Stalin, because all these things were ghostwritten. But we shouldn't just say that of Stalin, because it was also true. You had Chinaboda worked with Mao, right? Obviously Xi Jinping's speeches today are worked on, by different speechwriters and so forth. So it's very common, right? I said this before. I think behind every major public figure, you'll find, a writer, if not a full-fledged PR department, right? And we also today we have Timothy Schultz, who participated in the Capital Group, but he hasn't been around in a while. So he's coming around to share his wonderful observations with us. Say hi to everyone, Tim.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be back. I'm glad I graduated my undergrad, so now I actually have time.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you did for your undergrad?
Oh well, I did. I got a double major from U of O in math and philosophy, and so that kind of took most of my time. And then I did a thesis in my senior year on Charles Sanders Peirce's phenomenology, which was really just exploring Hegel and Kant and seeing kind of his use of a lot of those thinkers without doing it because he doesn't properly cite people all the time, and you have to dig through like 8 volumes worth of work, which is like 2,000 pages or something like that. So it was fun, but I'm glad I'm done with it. Work on other stuff.
Well, now we're going to be talking about Mao, which is hopefully a little bit more immediate and invigorating for you. U of O, by the way, do you mean University of Oregon or University of Ottawa?
Oregon.
Oregon. Okay, I was just checking because I used to hang out, and kind of loiter in the Hegel classes at the University of Ottawa in Canada. So I wonder, but it's Oregon. I'm sure Oregon's nicer than Ottawa, by the way.
Look,
the worst of the G8 capitals. Sorry?
We just legalized most of our drugs. They're decriminalized now, so there's a legal speedball you can do. So
Yeah.
if you ever want to come by.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Definitely an appealing offer. I think Mao would describe that as personal liberalism.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably a liberal according to Mao because, liberalism is just a lot of annoying things put together under the title of liberalism.
Yeah, it's like identity politics, right? Like it's like I know what it means, but obviously, when Marxists use these terms, they have a whole different, kind of broadly kind of conspiratorial vertigo.
Yeah,
I cop to that.
Yeah, this really felt like Mao's 12 rules for life or something like that. Actually, they're 11, right? It's 11 rules. Right?
11. Where does he? Oh, you mean the liberalism?
Yeah.
It's 11. Yeah.
Okay, so the first
more, but there are 11 of these principles.
Let's talk about Mao's 12 rules for life, and I think inevitably you end up doing this because one of the big things about Mao, right? And these essays, I think most of them are from the 1950s, right? So let's try to contextualize here a little bit. Like the earliest essays we read were from prior to the Chinese victory over the nationalists, where they took power in 1949. These essays that we're looking at today are mostly from the first decade of Mao's rule. And that was quite a golden age, right? Because things in China really, there was a huge consolidation of infrastructure, education, and so on before the Great Leap Forward in 1958, right? And some of Mao's comments about steel, we'll get into that, but they're quite suggestive in this respect. But the thing about Mao's writing in general, by the way, if you want to know, the three great eras of Chinese leadership are considered to be for the Communist Party are considered to be Mao's first 10 years, so from 49 to the Great Leap Forward, and then Deng from 78 to 92, right up to his southern tour, and then Xi Jinping from the last 8 years, right? So those are the three core golden ages of the core leaders, right? Before they got kind of older and indulged in certain excesses, right? We'll see about Xi, but he wants to make China more masculine. I hear. Did you see that?
Oh, right. Yeah.
But it's not about gender. It's not about gender.
No.
This feminization. He said the feminization. It's just that it's really just about generic cultural decadence that is then gendered as feminine, and it's really, as they say, a capital-induced aesthetic vulgarization.
Right. I feel it ties perfectly to what we were talking about last time. Right at the end, about the warehouse and who does what. It's a certain level of pragmatism that gets confused with, through the liberal lens.
Yeah. Well, we're good. We're a good model for Xia's society because we have 11 admins and 10 of them are men. So this is the future she wants. No, I'm just joking. No, but all jokes aside, on the bright side, however dubious that kind of thing is, you can see that China has progressively been becoming more tolerant with respect to gay rights, and I think the People's Daily supported that, and women's rights. So very different than a place like Russia, where Putin has actually exploited the issue of gay rights, for example, to sort of in kind of a fascistic vein, right, to paint it as sort of being like a conspiracy waged by America and international bourgeois capitalists, right? I mean, here you see that with the Chinese policy, you see a little bit of that, right? Because they're talking about feminization as being a sort of, foreign, potentially toxic influence. But they haven't gone nearly so far as to say, well, homosexuality is that, or feminism is that, right? So I think, I'm not trying to justify the policy as is, but I think there is quite a difference there as well, right? It's one that just like men should be like the guy in Wolf Warrior. I just got to do more physical education classes.
Yeah.
Not sit around playing fucking online games all day, your Fortnite. Okay. Anyway, let's get into this. So about 12 rules. So I just want to say this about this. Okay. Mao's 11 rules for life. So this is an essay called Combat Liberalism. And in it, Mao describes, a set of different dissidential or unconstructive behaviors for the Communist Party, and he paints them with the broad brush of liberalism. And I was just going to say that I think you end up inevitably communicating this way, because Mao, if you look at his essays, one of the things that's very clear when you look at them is that Mao is trying to communicate to a mass audience. And you see with like the repetitions and the clarifications, this is very clear. And he also was a peasant himself, so I think he understood how to do that. Upper class peasant, but still, he was a kulak. But I think you're, the thing is, we're so conditioned by this idea of like religious dogma. Here, it's like 12. It's like it's like the commandments, right? Here are your rules for life. I mean, obviously, on some level, this is quite undialectical, right? But I think when you start communicating to people who are conditioned, by those kind of theological, or in China's case with Confucianism and so forth, perhaps crypto-theological, codes of behavior and so forth, it's very natural at some point to sort of indulge that same reflex, kind of like that way. So why don't you guys? Do you guys want to tell me about the 11 forms of liberalism that Mao?
Right. Well, we can go over a couple of them at least. See if there's something we can extract from them. Right?
Anything you want, yeah. If you guys want to pull up.
Yeah. So Mao says that liberalism manifests itself in various ways. Right. He says to let things slide for the sake of peace and friendship when a person has clearly gone wrong, and refrain from principled argument because he's an old acquaintance, a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, an old colleague, or an old subordinate, or to touch on the matter lightly instead of going into it thoroughly so as to keep on good terms. The result is that both the organization and the individual are harmed. This is one type of liberalism. So I think, as you're saying, Conrad, that the crux of this whole essay is avoiding certain types of conduct that might be what Mao calls deviations, right, from dialectical behavior, I would say. So, and again, I bring back the comment that he's a bit too Freudian sometimes, especially when he talks about the father and so on. But we can go into that later. But in this case, he's talking about preserving appearances, right? And I think that if we try to give it a bit of a psychoanalytical reading, appearances are usually completely made up, right? This isn't there is no actual substance to the appearance, right? And there is a certain I guess call for civility in liberal politics right now that obsesses over appearance, right? Or the appearance of things in general. I'm not talking aesthetics. I mean, I am talking aesthetics, but purely aesthetics, right? And I feel like Mao touches a little bit on this point, and of course he goes on to do the same over and over, right? As you say, reiterating in different ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, so he talks about different things. He says they say to be among the masses and fail to conduct propaganda and agitation, or speak at meetings, or conduct investigations and inquiries among them, and instead to be indifferent to them and show no concern for their well-being, to behave as if, forgetting that one is a communist and behaving as if one were an ordinary non-communist. I like that phrase, ordinary non-communist. To see someone harming the interests of the masses and yet not feel indignant or dissuade or stop him or reason with him, but to allow him to continue. This is an 8 type. Yeah, so I see what you're saying. It's like, and it's really interesting because I think, so he's saying here, like, let's get at the real problems, right? Like it's not this aesthetic of, sort of civility, right? And this kind of, camaraderie, like, oh, you're my friend, whatever. And I think it's very interesting because I feel like all of Marxism is kind of based on this, and I think Mao is very, very attentive to this, right? When he says, like, the one becomes two, right? All of Marxism, I think, is based on the necessity of rupture, whereas the goal of that rupture is to elucidate, the fundamental factors which define our social reality. Right. So this is Marx's scientific break with the German ideology in 1845. It's like there you have because before he's kind of just talking about subjectivity, alienation, right? In this way influenced by Feuerbach, but a bit more negative. But In 1845, he starts talking about, relations of production, social formations, means of production, and so forth. And this, it's interesting. Like, I think you have to go back kind of to like, not to get too far afield, but I think you kind of have to go back and look at like what Feuerbach was doing with Hegel, right? Where Feuerbach was like, oh, well, Hegel's dialectic is just the expression of biological man, right? And like the predicates of a substance, are just it's its existence, which just fulfills its essence, right? But so like in a way, Marx has a problem with this, right? Because he sees it as being ultimately tautological, but at the same time, what he retains is the search for the real problem, right? Like, and we could even say the real substance, because Marx actually calls Feuerbach, he says he's an inverse Schelling, right?
Okay.
Schelling looking for the Grund beneath the dialectic, right? Because the dialectic, it's like, at the level of ideas, but this is the idea. It's not getting, to the fundamental, productive forces, means of production, relations of production, and so on, right? So I think Mao is very in that spirit, right? Because he's like, if we just preserve appearances, if we just have this kind of, we facilitate, the diffusion of these kind of niceties in conversation, that we're not going to be able to identify what he has elsewhere called the principal contradiction. Right. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I would say I think most of the problems with, I would say the greatest theoretical difficulties with Marxism in many ways come from this division between appearance and essence that, obviously has been questioned by post-structuralism, and can be very, very difficult, right, to uphold, because it's like, ends become means and means become means become ends. I mean, what did Nietzsche say, right? Those Greeks were superficial out of profundity, right? So, this like this anti-superficial gesture, you see the risk of it as well, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting, like we were talking about the masculine feminine issue. I was reading an essay about like, the destruction of feminine cultures in Maoist China, right? And so you see this sort of risk, right? Because it's like, if we're like, oh, we're just trying to look for utility, right? What we end up ultimately, foregrounding, right, is a particular kind of subjectivity which is perceived as more essential, right, to the operation of society, right? And there's a risk of, there's a risk of forms of marginalization. Now, I think Mao was trying to do a lot of good things for women, so I'm not to diminish that. Right?
No, but it's a consequence of how things operate. I think we can see it reflected again on Mao's criticism of Stalin, right?
In what sense do you mean, like in
the sense of that Mao saying the same thing about Stalin, right? They focus on a particular kind of project without taking into account the whole thing. But Mao can see the whole thing because he's Mao, not Stalin. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the consistent move I think Mao makes, is toward like, and it's based on his own. So like for him, like contradiction isn't necessarily contradiction in a dialectical sense. It's more of like a social antagonism or something, right?
It's a real opposition instead of a logical opposition.
Yeah.
Like the content setup.
Yeah, because he does use contradiction. He does allude to it in nature too. So we shouldn't say social antagonism as such. But yeah, I mean, I think Mao's consistent gesture is to look for where the appearance is resulting, has elided, right? The principal contradiction, right?
Yeah, I think Ender nailed it in the head. His comment at the bottom.
Mao, don't adopt British politeness and passive aggressiveness. Oh well. They did pretty well for themselves. They did pretty well for themselves in the imperial frontier. So someone's got to be said for that. But obviously, colonialism, is very, it demands a great deal of, social hypocrisy as well, right? So,
they are our teachers.
Sorry, Timothy, what were you saying?
Oh, just to add, like, with On Contradiction, he was writing it against the dogmatists in the party, or I think that was the initial setup. And you said that this one was written, like this is from a later period, or at least we're at the division in the book. So, I mean, at least like connecting the two ideas, like the dogmatists kind of just got to say things, and this can kind of be seen as an attempt, especially with, I think, Number two, but number one and number two, when you hear about criticism and keeping criticisms private, instead one should make them public. There's a desire to make the conflicts instead of just trying to hide them underneath the, kind of Confucian-ish appearance of tranquility, the actual underlying tensions within the party that need to be sorted out.
Yeah, so this essay is from 1937, by the way. So this one's still earlier.
Okay, I mean, it's still probably, they both can.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I would stress that I think you want to differentiate Maoism into two principal phases. And I think his first exposure to Marx's work around 1920, I think, in the late, if I'm not mistaken, in the late 20s, or like his first attempts at writing. And then I think his selected works is published in the late 30s. So I think early Maoism, which is defined above all, I think, by the sort of mythic portrayal of Mao in Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China in terms of his persona, is defined by, this sort of sensitivity to contradictions, superstructural elements, going beyond dogmatic formulations and so on. Late Maoism, which I think is more in the period of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, I think is defined more by a sort of cosmic perspective and sort of risky hyper-voluntarism. Like he takes some of these themes that he had earlier, like the importance of, superstructure ideology, against dogmatism and so forth. But he makes them so, in a way, he makes them so totally salient as principles that I think sometimes it blocks off the possibility for subtler analysis. But that's, so this is in the later part is when he's kind of, the later part is after Stalin's death, when Mao's starting to position himself as like the leader of the communist world, when you have the Sino-Soviet split and all of that. So I think you want to, I would roughly periodize Mao into two periods. I think you have kind of low Maoism and high Maoism, So I think we jump into high Maoism. I think we jump into high Maoism in like the next essay, right?
The atomic bomb or the.
Yes, this is your first, which is very, Oh, no. So wait, sorry. Let's go back on practice. Wait, so where are we here?
Combat Liberalism.
Combat Liberalism? Okay, sorry.
Yeah. The next one is the atomic bomb one,
Yeah,
let me pull that. Wait. Stupid thing doesn't have. Okay, yeah, so this is, now we're getting into high Maoism. So this is 1955, but 3 years before I think the Great Leap Forward. So in this essay, Mao, and these are apparently points of conversation with the Finnish envoy to China. And I like here when Mao says, he talks a little bit about the threat of the atomic bomb and, the experience of European aggression in China. I like a little bit when Mao says, in the past, he's saying, well, Finland and China have always had good relations. In the past, China's wars with European countries were only with Britain, France, Germany, Tsarist Russia, Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Holland.
Yeah, just to make sure they all know, right?
He has a good sense of humor. Like, you read through it,
they're on the list.
Humor.
Yeah.
So here he puts forth, this is quite famous, this stuff with Mao. So he talks about, of course, he laments Taiwan. He talks about, and he goes on to discuss the atomic bomb. And so this is very famous. I should read from here. The United States cannot annihilate the Chinese nation with its small stack of atom bombs. Even if the US atom bombs were so powerful that when dropped on China, they would make a hole right through the earth, or even blow it up, that would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole, though it might be a major event for the solar system. So now we're into high Maoism. That's interesting. Actually, I heard, and this is what I said, this kind of cosmic level he gets to. And I think it's funny, like it's very interesting. But I think the problem here is like, I think, the identification of what he calls the principal contradiction earlier requires, the sensitivity to the principal contradiction, as well as public opinion, right? And in his early work, this is very, very much the case where he's saying, well, what do we need to do to get the peasants to support us? We looked every social class. I mean, here he starts saying things like, well, if they dropped atom bombs on us, there'd probably be 300 million Chinese left. We'd be okay. I think it's a culture that is facilitated by a lack of democratic accountability, that he also is aware of, right? And militates against. So it's very, very contradictory. I mean, the Cultural Revolution, mass democracy, right? That's what it's called, right? But he never finds, I think, an adequate institutional expression of that, which is what Zizek points out early on, right? Actually, there's a funny thing about this with apparently there was a conversation at the Comintern with Togliatti from Italy. Togliatti was the leader of the Italian Communist Party. Of course, Gramsci died. You had Bordega was the leader, I think, and then Gramsci, because Bordega became like a Trotskyist, ultra left, whatever. And then Togliatti, and Togliatti died in 1964. But I think in the late 50s, so China got the atom bomb in about, I want to say it's like 1956 or something. They got the atom bomb. You can double check it for me. I don't know. But it was like some years after the States. And there was a conversation with Togliatti, and Mao, he basically said, well, if the US drops a bunch of atom bombs on us, China's a big country. We'll still have like 300 million people, and we'll be able to like repopulate the earth and, spread socialism. And Togliatti responded, yeah, but what about Italy? Because like we're a small country, who knows? Like we could be totally fucked. And Mao apparently responded. He said, who said anything about Italians? He said there'll be 300 million Chinese. That'll be enough to repopulate the earth. So this is high Maoism. This is kind of the level we're getting at, right? Does he say here about war? Does he talk here about war?
No, that's the next one. U.S. imperialism.
Right?
Okay, yeah. So we should let's move to the next.
Oh wait,
essay.
he talks about the millet plus rifles, which is a little bit about war in this one, and then he moves on to the next. So I'm just gonna read this about millet plus rifles, right? So he says, we have an expression, millet plus rifles. In the case of the United States, it is planes plus the A-bomb. However, if the United States, with its planes plus the A-bomb, is to launch a war of aggression against China, then China, with its millet plus rifles, is sure to emerge the victor. The people of the whole world will support us. And I think this is also important to read. As a result of the First World War, the Tsar, the landlords, and the capitalists in Russia were wiped out. As a result of the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek and the landlords were overthrown in China, and the East European countries and a number of countries in Asia were liberated. Should the United States launch a Third World War, and were it to last 8 or 10 years, the result would be the elimination of the ruling classes in the United States, Britain, and the other accomplice countries, and the transformation of most of the world into countries led by the communist parties. World wars end not in favor of the warmongers, but in favor of the communist parties and the revolutionary people in all lands. If the warmongers are to make war, then they mustn't blame us for making revolution or engaging in subversive activities, as they keep saying all the time.
I think, I struggle a little bit with this formulation. So, it's often said that without World War I, that like, Europe would have went socialist, Germany, for example, obviously other places.
Right.
I think if you look at something like World War I, you can see that countries that, didn't fare well in terms of their experience in the war, were placed at the risk of internal revolt, right? So we saw this with Turkey, right? Ataturk, right? You can see the same thing with Lenin. You could say a similar thing with World War II, right? The places that were, under the Nazi jackboot, a lot of them got absorbed into the communist bloc. Places that were relentlessly attacked by Japan, right? When communists, like China, North Korea. But I think the kind of it's a bit more complicated than he makes it out here. I mean, because I think that the truth is that the places that the winners are often able to avert this.
Right. You can tell it even right now with the pink tide, right? Mm-hmm. We have this whole mass movement of left-wing victories in electoral means in Latin America. Mm-hmm. Half a decade later, it's all rolled back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, and I wonder, though I do think, I would just be interested in analyzing this formulation more. I do think, about the world wars, I do think there's, a general state of chaos, right?
Sure.
In which, sometimes to resist, encroachments or oppressive governments, populations are mobilized to a very high degree. And I think that makes the possibility of popular revolt, you look at Italy, right, where it was a very, very delicate thing, after the Americans arrived in 1943 to try to disarm the partisans who had overthrown Mussolini. So I think, in China, right, the militarization against Japan, right? So I do think that in terms of areas, getting which are do not emerge, gloriously victorious in these wars, and in terms of the general destabilizations which are affected in those regions and some others, that can help increase, right? But I just wonder about it, right? Because it's like, I do wonder if in a way, because Steven Pinker will talk about, like in the past 50 years, everyone's like the world has like generally gotten richer, the third world and the first world have become more, there's greater equality between them and this kind of thing. And I do wonder if the sort of dramatic destabilization affected by war, it may be the case, right, that it really helps bring about these kind of, like when you have this sort of social peace, free market, international trade, that it really helps stabilize bourgeois rule, right? But I would just need to, it's very complex. That's what I would say.
Yeah, there's one thing that was, I don't know, there's a thought I've been having when going through Mao's stuff again, which is kind of the essentially like the power of the negative, and especially when he starts talking about like with the atom bomb here, and kind of scaling out to a different, to the universal scale, and it kind of nullifies the actual death, or it's like, oh, the Italians won't make it, but some of these people will make it. And there's almost like an attempt to kind of disavow the negative. It seems to me like this is just kind of it's still underdeveloped, but that the contradiction kind of gets pushed to the side almost by shifting a viewpoint is something I'm a bit concerned with, just in the sense of it's not that it doesn't seem like it's going through and that suffering through it and then you arrive at the end. It's more of there's something happening, we can kind of shift away and look at it in a different way, and things kind of resolve, and you have a unity of opposites that's a little bit more peaceful. I question the peacefulness of it, since especially if you look at this transition of the World War I to World War II, in the opposite country, or in the the losing countries, well, except for Italy, whatever, without going into the details too much, but I mean, you have the rise of fascism here, so like it's not just a simple transition, that there is this reversal here, and there's like it's not just there's a unity of opposites, but like an opposite emerges out of the thing. It's not like they're two freestanding opposites in the sense of they're like stationary in any sort of way, which I think is something that can accidentally emerge if you aren't careful with it. But it's hard to read this document in general, just because, like you were talking about with the high Maoism, is it serves more purposes than just being a theoretical document of what are we going to do? They have a bomb, we don't. How are we going to cope with that? And just trying to work through that world. But
I think that there are traces of what Mao talks about right now. I would say that we are living through kind of those movements. In Mexico, there was the popular reaction of the self-defense movements. In the South, there's the Zapatista collectives, and in the East, in the West, there are the self-defense municipalities. I don't know if you guys know about that, but like entire municipalities have been taken over by popular front, by a popular front, and they don't have. They don't allow the federal government in anymore, right? Of course, that's not a project, right? That's not what I'm saying. Well, what I'm saying is that these are symptoms of the reaction that Mao talks about, right? As long as there is war that is happening, not just actual armed conflicts, but even imperialist economic war, there will be reaction, and that reaction will be manifold.
Yeah. So like and I think that's a good point to kind of turn into the next essay. Would you be okay for that? Yeah. So the next essay is called, it's from, let's see here. It's from 1956, and it's part of a talk with two Latin American public figures. It's called U.S. Imperialism is a Paper Tiger. And the history of Maoism in Latin America, by the way, is quite robust. I know I was reading, so Peru in particular, I think in Peru you had, you had a famous Marxist theorist from Peru. What is his name?
Was it the...
Got a big influence on
Gonzalo?
like
Gonzalo?
Maratigui? Jose Carlos Maratigui?
Maybe. I mean, Peru, there's the Shining Path. But
then later you had Shining Path and Guzman.
But you're talking about before, right?
Yeah, before. So I was saying Peru is exceptional because they had this one of the most famous Marxists in the history of Latin America, maybe the most famous for theoretical production.
There's also Chairman Gonzalo, but that's from 19. Yeah, he was born in 1934.
Well, yeah,
Must be before, right?
Maratiegui was born in 1894.
Yeah, there we go. There we go.
Yeah. You see that. So you had this guy, but then later you had
thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Better pronunciation. Then later, I can barely do the French. Lived here 5 years. You can then later you have Shining Path, like the Maoists in Peru and Guzman. So you have quite a robust Maoist and Marxist history in Peru, but I think in many other countries as well. But I just read Julia Laval's big book on Maoism, and in Latin America, Peru was the one she zoomed in on for discussing Maoism. Would you say that Peru has been the most where Maoism has had the greatest influence in Latin America? Do you know?
Well, I can't think of other parties like Sendero Luminoso, but and I wouldn't qualify Venezuelan socialism as Maoist. And I don't think we have any. Yeah, Maoism was suppressed in the United States and in Mexico pretty much at the same time.
Yeah, though I think you have to remember that, it's also a question of what is Maoist, because I think, definitely in Latin America, they put their own unique spin on it. And a lot of the questions concern questions of indigeneity, right, which is very important.
Right.
But I just mean, at the same time, it's I think Mao, more than anyone else, is responsible for propagating the model of asymmetric warfare that becomes diffused throughout the third world, right?
Right.
So Vietnam, or
one of them, right? Because you have, of course, Che Guevara, right?
Yeah, but this is a lot before. Mao's in the
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What was the essay you guys read earlier on where he starts going into war? Was that on Practice where he starts to talk a little bit about that?
Asymmetric warfare?
Yeah, I feel like it mentioned at one point in this book, but this is a memory that's 6 months old, so it's probably wrong.
Well, I gotta. So if I'm gonna, for a while, it took me a long time. It takes a long time to figure out, because you don't study these things in school. It took me a long time to figure out what I would describe.
He does talk of war on Practice.
Okay. Yeah. I remember him talking.
Go ahead, Conrad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took me a long time to figure out what I think the fundamentals of Maoism are, and I would cite 3 points as being representative of Maoism in the broad sense. And the first one, I think, is the necessity of, rather than, the sort of teleology, if you were, of capital, right, of asymmetric warfare waged by peasants as being the means through which revolution can be accomplished, a fixation on the importance of ideology and culture, and how that can take the place of the principal contradiction, as well as anti-imperialism, right? And this whole theory of, principal, primary, secondary contradiction as an contradiction. And I think the third point that I would describe is the focus on avoiding the cultivation of this sort of Stalinist impersonal bureaucracy, right? And I don't think he ultimately realized a solution to that, but it's clearly something he was involved with. Right. So those would be what I would say are the 3 principles of Maoism. We could, and I think you can see all 3 of those, I think, have a big purchase in Latin America too, right?
Yeah. They don't always show up, as explicitly Maoist, but they are part of the radical tradition, right?
So the next essay it's called U.S. Imperialism is a Paper Tiger from 1956. And I'm not, I don't know if we have to belabor too much the details of this. He talks about, China's remarkable success against the nationalists in the Civil War. And he talks about how the United States, in spite of appearing very powerful, right, militarily and so forth, is perhaps not so powerful as it seems. And I think, he highlights a very good point here, which is just that, we often talk about these regimes as if they're, ironclad and undefeatable. But, a regime depends on the people. Right. And, I think they've done statistics if 2% of a population gets out in the streets, a regime collapses, basically. Right. So they're not always so strong as they seem. The United States in the era of communism, the United States went to extraordinary efforts to sort of purchase the consent of the public, in the form of the sort of Keynesian full employment, sort of stuff. As the communist bloc declined, they promptly jettisoned that. It's a bit to simplify. I guess what I mean is that, I think in many ways it's been more precarious historically. If you think of the grandeur and the might of the United States, look at today, it's very precarious. Look at, the Vietnam War, at times it was very precarious. Look at, the Great Depression, right? Grapes of Wrath era, very precarious, right? So, it's like the United States has narrowly averted, serious internal upheaval, right, on several occasions, and that they've had the skill and good, that the bourgeois in America has had the skill and good fortune to do that, is what's allowed it to be so dominant. But it's not clear that they'll be able to avert that again and again and again, right? Right now, we seem to be in a situation where the United States is unable to make the fundamental systematic changes that it would need to achieve social peace because of how directed by capital, right? The lack of independence of politics in the United States. That's not a problem you have in China, whatever other problems you have. Corruption, there are problems, but the fundamental direction is political.
They were able to change how they were producing to, actually deal with the virus and lock down Wuhan. Was it Wuhan where it started?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Doug talked about it on one video or something like that. Just the comparison between the Chinese and kind of the rest of the world response.
Yeah, I think that video got demonetized or delisted or something, because I think I shouldn't say anything else, because if I speak of the same topic again, we might get the same thing.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's it's Facebook and we're broadcasting to private groups, but
okay. We're on YouTube too.
Technically on YouTube, yeah. I think it's on the channel.
I mean,
let's not ruin Silence.
We're like the Viet Cong strategy. We go to many, the small and the weak will overcome. We go to many different channels. We're unbannable, right? So when we destroy all the big leftist heavy organizations, we'll still be left, right? Doing our thing.
Yeah, we'll still be there.
But apparently the internet, by the way, was based on the Viet Cong. I don't know, because they were like, America was so sort of impressed by the Vietnamese victory that when they were making the internet, they created the idea was to have it supported everywhere, so it could never be taken down. Right? It was like
teachers by positive example.
Yeah. So I like that. I read that in Sadie Plant, Zeros and Ones, a great book that makes the argument that women and computers are the same. Highly recommend you check it out.
Oh, that. When is Conrad when are we going to make the accelerationist turn? Go to the CCRU, right?
We have to go all the way to Xi first.
Oh, yeah. Xi and he's there. Nick Land's there right now, so it's perfect.
Yeah.
So
we'll take Nick Land after Xi. We can take Nick Land. And I want to. I've been wanting to write a book.
If you want to go.
I've been wanting to write a book for a while called Little Nicky in Big China of Xi Jinping and Nick Land.
Please.
Oh God, yeah, please. No, that sounds like a great idea.
I wanted to compare, this sort of accelerationist intensification to Xi's notion of sort of like a primary stage of socialism, and how which of these visions, is preferable, and to really treat these people like serious philosophers. Which, right. I mean, I don't know if at this, especially at this point, if Land is really more serious than Xi. But as a pure philosopher,
serious. I think Xi's more serious than Land at the moment.
Even if he's a semi-pro, yeah.
By the way, just one thing about that I wanted to point out in the essay that I found kind of interesting, just so I was looking through it. It's like the third paragraph. It says, our friends in Latin America, Asia, Africa are all in the same position as we are doing. As we are doing the same kind of work, doing something for the people to lessen their oppression by imperialism. Actually, maybe this was not the right one. There's one line in here, maybe I'm not sure where it is now, but about working with indigenous people, and then also like dividing the.
It's actually a previous paragraph.
Oh, okay. The previous one then is what I mean.
Yeah.
But, I just found like an interesting parallel between like Fanon and Wretched of the Earth and what's going on right here, because Fanon has the in his critique of the nationalist consciousness of initially it's the kind of like black good, white bad in the very primitive form, but eventually it develops in the sense of turns out there are bourgeois elements within your nationalist framework, and there are people of imperialist origin, colonial origins, who are on your side. You kind of see this process of universalization. So I think that's just an interesting connection point right here.
Oh, by the way, I just want to say I will get to this question when we go to Stalin's economic problems of the USSR. So it'll be important to discuss difference between commodity production and capitalist production, which a lot of people still don't seem to understand. You guys got to go back and read your Mendel or your Stalin. But it's good. You got to read it. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say one thing too about this. So obviously, in this time, China sponsored like a huge amount of international movements. It's absolutely crazy, the scope of it. Groups like fucking Baader Meinhof, had like, you know, some tenuous connection to Maoism, obviously North Korea, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Peru, you know, on and on, India, right? There were movements that were supported all over. And China tends to deny this today. They're like, oh, China's never been, you know, a country that wishes to expand its influence. But there was actually, you know, I mean,
It's right here.
Mao was high Maoism was very internationalist. I mean, like, while their own people were starving, they were exporting grain to Albania, right, to kind of build up their international clout. So, I mean, at the peak of like the Great Leap Forward, right? So, but I just want to say here regarding so one thing Mao says here, and I just want to, so you know, of course, he's talking about the fundamental that U.S. imperialism is a paper tiger, and it's not as strong as it seems. But he says here, yeah, therefore it is nothing to be afraid of and can be despised. But today the United States still has strength, turning out more than 100 million tons of steel a year and hitting out everywhere. That is why we must continue to wage struggles against it, fight it with all our might, and wrest one position after another from it. And that takes time. So part of this, so this was written in, let's see here, 56. So just sort of before the Great Leap Forward. Now in the Great Leap Forward, one of the big goals they wanted to make was, one of the big targets they had was steel production, right? So what they would do is like, they actually had like backyard smelting. I don't know, you know, like people in their own yards would be like putting things in and like making.
Wasn't that kind of a mess if I recall? Because it made like mostly pig iron instead of proper steel.
There are debates on it. I think some
So a lot of pig iron and some not pig iron.
By some account, it did by any account, it did sort of raise steel production, but the problem was just that the allocation of resources that they pursued, you know, the result was systemic grain shortages and ultimately a lot of starvation. So it's a little bit ominous here when he mentions like the United States as being so admirable because of their steel production, and it gets to an issue that, you know, Deng is really going to try to address later, which is that you can't just try to modify the relations of production in lieu of corresponding changes in the means of production. Right, which is going to be very important to the Dengist sort of program. Should we move on to concerning Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR from 1958? Move on to that.
Let's go.
Yeah, let's do it.
Any thoughts on this one, guys? Any thoughts on this one?
Well, this is where the little Freudian slip comes in that I mentioned earlier. He a little bit further on, he says that he's talking about, you know, how to apply different systems of regimentation, and he says that the great system is a father-son relation, a cat and mouse relation. It has to be attacked day after day. And, you know, I thought it was interesting that he plays out that there's this Oedipal structure, right, that has to be resolved every day. It can't just be analyzed once and then pushed to the closet.
Yeah, which fits with you know, what Zizek describes, and also with Mao's own conception of permanent revolution, which of course differs from Trotsky's conception of permanent revolution. But yeah, so just to kind of, we can go over the particular points in a minute, but just to say that Stalin's Economic Problems of the USSR is a famous text, and it was published in 1951, shortly before his death. So one of the important claims made in the book is that Stalin claims that the law of value is still operative within a socialist economy. And Stalin also makes the claim that the Soviet Union had reached the first stage of communism, as, you know, implicitly outlined by Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program, right? So this is significant. Now, Ender Wiggin here asked me to, one second, to explain the difference between commodity production and capitalist production. Well, you know, if you think of like what is the form of value, right? What is the form of value, right? It refers to like the equivocity of exchange, right? So the regularization of values, right, of products between different economies, right? But capitalist production itself requires like, you know, specific, you know, systems of private property, law, and perhaps most significantly, the commodification of labor, right? So it was with the dead ending of serfdom that large number of laborers, right, their labor was actually commodified, and this created the sort of grist, right, for the operation of capitalism. Again, if you look at historical societies, it can get quite enigmatic to discuss, like, when does capital begin, right? And I was actually just going over my thesis yesterday and kind of, slapping myself on the wrist a bit for maybe not being, sensitive enough about the question. I think, Marx will say, like, interest-bearing capital is the first form of capital, alluding to the Borgs, right? Like in Europe, that developed from like the 11th century. You can have different analyses. I mean, some people argue slave ownership was a form of earlier capital, not in the classical mode of production, but in later modes of production. Some people, it's often said China, right, even in like the about 1,000 years ago, right, may have had elements of manufacturing capital, right, that were more developed than anything you'd see until Europe, until the Industrial Revolution, right. And then I think in Italy, right, in northern Italy in like the 15th century, you get elements of manufacture as well. So it's quite a complex history. But the point is just to say that capitalism, again, refers to a society that's fundamentally organized around the valorization of capital, right? And in which labor power, commodified labor power, is ascertainable, right? Mm-hmm. And barring those conditions, it's not capitalism. You can go back. Ancient Egypt had commodity exchange, right? They had markets and people exchanged commodities, right? Now the economy may have been based on direct public appropriation, but then even then you could say but the government also traded with other countries, which entails like an equivocity of value, right? So, and actually Ernst Mandel, one thing that's really interesting he says like, if you understand that in Marx's Capital, he fundamentally describes capitalism, but he also shows elements of the logic of commodity production tout court, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing Mandel points out is that you can also extrapolate from that commodity production persists within socialist economies, right? So even if you have like just public enterprises and you're not acquiring commodified labor power as such, like if you're just paying them out of revenue, right? You're still having like an exchange of commodities. But these are all complex questions, and to get into more of it here. But I just want to clarify that because it's somewhat important. So we can go. I want to go through each point in this essay, but I just want to say generally, in terms of summing it up, I think Mao, if I'm not mistaken, Mao's big beef with this is that he differentiates between public ownership and collective ownership. And by collective ownership, he refers to government ownership or communal ownership, communes. And he claims that those are not correspondent with the direct control of local producers, right? So he criticizes Stalinism for emphasizing the heavy industry, but not paying enough attention to light industry, for example. And he criticizes it for a kind of like bureaucratic centralization that involves the dispossession, right, of actual peasants, right? But maybe so this is just kind of the preliminary, but maybe we can go through and actually in the critique of Stalin, so the next essay, critique of Stalin's economic problems of the USSR. Maybe we can go through and actually look at each of the critiques and look at them.
Sure.
So there's how many critiques do we have here? There's
20 something.
There's 27.
Yeah.
27 critiques. Okay, let's try to go through these quick. Okay, would that be okay, guys?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the first one, he criticizes the point for stressing too much the role of government and not, conformance with the will of the working class and what he calls objective economic laws. The second one I really like. He claims that Stalin doesn't acknowledge that the human capability to transform natural laws has no limit, which I just think is fucking incredible. Number 3. So Stalin talks about the laws of economic development, the laws of political economy, and as in the case of natural science, are objective laws reflecting processes of economic development which take place independently of the will of man. Mao, then, how do we go about planning the economy? He responds. Number 4, that is why Engels says in the same book, yeah, so people, he says, people can have freedom or something. Okay, I don't know.
It's actually what we were saying, like way earlier, that the law confronts the people understand the law, and then they can control the law.
Oh yeah, that's right. If we go back to on practice, right? That's
exactly.
Right. Yeah, it's a good one.
Okay. As he says here, freedom is as necessary objective law understood by the people, which I think you can at least, I don't know, make the Hegel connection with the awareness of like the I equals I without limits. And so it's the understanding of the movement through different shapes, but without bringing too much of like the Hegelian system into this. But there seems
so we
to
should.
Yeah. I mean, I can't, we only have like 20 minutes left. So if we want to.
You don't really do Hegel talks in like an hour. It's like
I don't know. But I do think that the there is still the attempt to understand the objective side and the subjective and objective side, and a unity of these two things, which I do think you can definitely see, especially with the when Hegel makes the I don't know, like the ethic or the action turn or whatever at some point in the phenomenology, where it's like the crux of the matter isn't just a private thinking over that's dispassionate, not involved in the things, but is actually alive here. And guess what? Being open to yourself is also being open to everybody else. And so, especially with making sense of the contradictions, and like he'll talks about this one in the managing the contradictions of the people a little bit more, which we aren't going to get here to today. But
next time, yeah.
But this time, but at least for right now, I do think that there's a trying to think this thought through in his own terms, and so he's not. I don't know. I just want to connect the Hegel thing here, because I do think there's a continuous line here instead of just like here's a demarcation. Here, everything after this point is good and such forth.
Yeah, and you can also argue, like, if you look at, I mean, Althusser, I think huge Maoist influence, right? In terms of contradiction over determination, the independence of the superstructure, and influenced by Gramsci as well. But I think, like, if you look at the way that Althusser treats, interpolation, right, as being part of social reproduction, right, or being part of the reproduction of capital, right, in terms of the way subjectivities are produced, right? I think you can see this, and you see it like even in Zizek, right, where he says like, if we look at the objective world, like subjectivity is part of that. And I think you can see that like the way that Mao makes this kind of space, for this sort of, aleatory subjective element, right, in these equations, right, which I think is what he's sort of concerned with, right, when he's talking about this.
It's just importantly, it's a social subjectivity, not an individual subjectivity. A lot of he really wants to bring in the social here, which I think is, we've seen that all throughout the essays we've been seeing.
Yeah, very clear, very anti-liberal here.
Yeah, especially in the anti-liberal. But anyway, let's continue.
Five, he just says, like, I like the humility, right? Can socialist construction work? People still have doubts. Does our Chinese practice conform to the economic law of China? This has to be studied. My view is that if the practice conforms generally, things will be all right. Very encouraging words from but it shows you, I mean, the thing, things were happening so fast, like in China, and this continues in the Deng era. It was like a constant ethic of like, experiment, self-critique, experiment, self-critique, experiment, self-critique. And that was it. Like, they didn't really know, but that's also, like that, approached critically, that's also been, the engine of a tremendous dynamism, in China, in terms of like staging regional experiments, and then people being like, oh, well, this didn't work because of this, right? They weren't just looking at a model that was, provided to them, by more powerful countries that were trying to exploit them. They were trying to create their own model, right? And and yeah, sometimes it fucked up, right? But if you look at where China is on the whole, you have to say that there's a great success too. And sorry for the millions of people who died. But all due respect, it was for a good cause. Okay, 6. Yeah, okay, just something about whatever.
Mao pretty humbly points out that if we ruin things, it will show that Chinese Marxism does not work.
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah, because like, I think definitely,
it.
Yeah, I think in the future too, right? Like, you got to think about, in terms of like, if China becomes like the world's most powerful state, like, and if its current, Keynesian post-communist sort of edifice remains, still nominally Marxist, Maoist, I have to think like the level of global interest in these topics is going to increase enormously. I mean, because this is like everybody likes a winner. Everybody likes a winner. It reminds me of those business courses they have in China. They have business courses for that teach they combine Mao Zedong thought with Western management practices.
Okay.
And I guess the guy who started these classes in Shenzhen, he got disgusted with Western management manuals because they talk about employees like their physical inputs.
Yeah.
But they've got like business. Yeah. They've got like businessmen who go there. Like, and I love like one of the guys, like, he's like, of course Mao was a great businessman. Like he's quoted in this book. He's like, how could he take something, this small and make it something this great? So I like this rereading of Mao as the
the
Chinese
ultimate capitalist. Yeah.
Yeah, the Chinese businessman par excellence. Yeah, but you say ultimate capitalist, but remember that Chinese business is really connected with the public sector, so it's even more complicated than that, right?
Right.
We'll just skirt the line.
Yeah. Thread it.
So number 7, to abolish it's you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the balance is the crux of the matter here? Because he starts going into the steel production next, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. So do you want to talk? I'm going to give you. I like to give you a curveball. We want to talk about the big one here, Timothy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Jesus! All right, what was the number 8? All right.
Yeah, so he's admitting that they had difficulties with planning here, right? As important as 8 years' achievements are, we were feeling our way along. Nonetheless, it cannot be said that our planning of production was entirely correct, that it entirely reflected the objective laws.
Yeah, here's the line. This one was weird. I wasn't sure what to make of this one because he starts talking about monism in regards to steel production, and that threw me for a loop, and I still don't know what to think about it. He says, it remains to be proved in objective practice. We worked on industry for 8 years, but did not realize that we had to take steel as the mainstay. This was the principal aspect of the contradiction in industry. It was monism. Among the large, the medium, and the small, we take the large as the mainstay. Between the center and the regions, between the center and the regions, the center. Of the two sides of any contradiction, one is the principal side. As important as 8 years' achievement are, we are feeling our way along. Nonetheless, it cannot be said that our planning of production was entirely correct, that it entirely reflected the objective laws. Planning is done by the whole party, not simply the planning committee or the economics committee, but at all levels. Everyone is involved. So yeah, I'm you were talking about how when you were going over the 3, what you think are the 3 aspects of Maoism, you mentioned the third one, which was the non-Stalinist bureaucracy.
Yeah, well, he says that here, right? He says that.
Yeah. I mean, very clearly he says that right here. It's not the economic committee, but it's a whole. And he references here the center and the outskirts. Though I'm not quite sure what his general notions of the center and the region are. I mean, there's physically the city, but at the same time, he's not just building giant cities. So this is just kind of I don't know enough about China, I think, to make sense of everything going on there. But I
think some of the terms are bureaucratic language, and they get translated in English, and there's no way of.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of awkward. What do you make of the monism comment of steel here?
It's hilarious.
I don't know.
So give me the quote. We got to give the quote here. Do you want to copy and paste that, Ernesto?
I'm going to try.
We worked on industry for 8 years, but did not realize that we had to take steel as the mainstay. This was the principal aspect of the contradiction in industry. It was monism. So I don't know. I mean, I want to get a dictionary.
I put it in the private chat. Can you show it from there, or can you not?
Yeah. A theory of doctrine that denies the existence of a distinction or duality in a particular sphere, such as that between matter and mind, or God and the world. Okay, well, I guess he's saying we denied the duality. I gotta say here, it's interesting though. There's a weird on one hand, Mao's saying well, we didn't do enough steel production in industry. On the other hand, he's saying the Soviet Union focused too much on industry. So there's a weird he's saying two different things here, not necessarily contradictory, right? but he's saying that we have to focus industry on steel, and we have to also, the Soviet Union, he said, didn't learn to walk with two legs, right? So we also have to pay attention to agriculture, right? Which goes back to the theme I said of asymmetrical peasant warfare, right?
Yeah.
Very, very all the main threads of Maoism, they all connect, right? Look at number 9 here. Okay. To say the mean, like I was a little confused about this. To say the means of production are not commodities deserve study. And I would like to know, I'd actually have to go through Stalin's book because I'd like to know what he's citing here. But
yeah, because it's not in the citation.
I mean, yeah, obviously, like, when you get like the thing is like these categories of political economy are abstract and there's huge debates about them, right? Like, like if you're Adam Smith, like capital starts with like, the first guy, who just like, gets some, one guy works kind of hard, I get some money and he's like, pay someone else. And that's how it works. Well, obviously this is like very historically insensitive, right? In terms of, ancient slavery and these different kind of things. But the point is like, in classical political economy, you can see capitalists starting, pretty much with the dawn of man, right? So I just think the debates over these terms are like, are enormous, right? But and even within Marxism, right? It's like, what is a commodity, right? Like, I wrote my whole thesis and then I realized like I didn't actually do like I never did like an analytical philosophy style. What is a commodity? If something is exchangeable and has a value, right? Then, in some sense you could say it's a commodity.
Yeah,
right?
Also,
how generally exchangeable does it have to be?
I mean, there's also the further development and say like with Gita board, where it's like a generalization into preset quantities of time and the exchangeability of time, which I do think is an interesting enough development here that can kind of take us beyond just the moving, or not saying right now, but in general, it's an interesting perspective here that gets us beyond talking about moving apples around, but makes sense of it in terms of manipulations of time and space.
Yeah, well, that's where most sophisticated value analytic readings go, right? So you get with like, Moishe Postone, for example, argues that like what he calls abstract time is like a consequence of like capitalist organization, which I have a bit of an issue with, just because I think it ignores like the transition of like the historically gradual development of the commodity form and commodity production. They said like in China they have a system of shi or qi, like double hours, that's from like up from the Song dynasty. And in that same period when that system became refined, they also had like the earliest elements of manufacturing capital. So it's like, but then like Postone, he'll be like, oh, but he's like, this isn't abstract time because the hours bore names. They weren't numbered serially. And it's like, I think you're being a little pedantic, dude. Like if you can't, it's not just like a hard cut with the capitalist mode of production. That's not how it works. So that's my criticism of that. But I do think it's very important to talk about temporality. Right? You see that with Tomba's schemas, right? With Postone, right? We have to talk about temporality. Value isn't like, it's not a physical thing. It's not like in the object in Marx, right? It's temporally and structurally dependent, right? And I think you've got to say like really, I think like, it's kind of, it's the 60s when they really get toward those like sophisticated readings of Marx, right? When you get people like, when you get situationism had an enormous influence, right? Like, just not that it was like, manifest in these big books or something. It had an enormous influence. Althusser, in terms of really studying Marx, Tronti. I mean, what you can see with these people is like critical theory mostly used resources from Hegelianism to explain Marx. But what I kind of like about the 60s stuff is that they actually go to Marx and try to, explain it in a grittier, kind of more material way, because I'm not that enthusiastic. Like philosophers love this stuff. Or you get like Adorno, like negative dialectics. I'm just like, okay, man. Like, it's like you're depressed. The world's always negative. Get it? It's like, because I said it's all based on Hegelianism. That's cool. It's great philosophy, but like, why are we Marxists, right? So little digression there, but
it's fine.
Maybe Timothy's mad. I don't know.
Oh, no. Look, I wear my Hegelianism on my sleeve quite proudly, and I am comfortable enough in it that not everybody needs to agree with me.
I mean, I love Hegel. You know what I'm saying? I think using
I'm I'm also 24, so I don't claim to like have to be like settled on most of these things.
Yeah.
I acknowledge my limitations, and I'm not a dogmatist.
I knew nothing when I was 24. Okay, on to number 10. In his section, Commodity Production Under Socialism, Stalin doesn't comprehensively set forth the conditions for the existence of commodities. The existence of two kinds of ownership is the main premise for commodity production, but ultimately commodity production is also related to the productive forces. For this reason, even under completely socialized public ownership, commodity exchange will still have to be operative in some areas. Okay. 11. So people get upset, like this quote, people get upset the minute they see commodity production, taking it for capitalism itself. But it looks as if commodity production will have to be greatly developed and the money supply increased for the sake of the solidarity of several hundred million peasants. This poses a problem for the ideology of several 100,000 cadres, as well as for the solidarity of several 100 million peasants. We now possess only a part of the means of production, but it appears that there are those who wish to declare at once ownership by the whole people, divesting the small and medium producers. So here again, we have our collective ownership as opposed to real public ownership. But they failed to declare the category of ownership. So in other words, like they were like, oh, it's just the people. Is it to be commune-owned or country-owned? To abolish commodities...
County.
Or county-owned. To abolish commodities and commodity production in this way, merely by declaring public ownership, is to strip the peasantry. At the end of 1955, procurement and purchase got us almost 90 billion. Okay, blah blah. But I think this is actually really, really important, right? Because what he's basically rejecting Stalinism here quite decisively, and also you could say opening up the door, I think in some ways toward kind of what happens with Deng, right? Because he's saying we're going to have to expand commodity production, which is preferable, right, to Soviet style, sort of public appropriation, right, or not public, collective, as he says, collective ownership or collective appropriation. So that's an important distinction in this text, right? So there you go. Mao is saying we have to expand commodity production. This is what people always forget, right? They like to simply polarize, right? The good Mao, the bad Deng, right? Mao called Deng back to Beijing, right, in the early 70s in order to try to help, get Deng to help in overcoming the instability that had been generated by the Cultural Revolution and to oppose the influence of the Gang of Four, right? So, Mao oscillated continually, right, in terms of his commitment to these sort of programs. So, again, I think I'm always a bit skeptical of these schemes, a bit like Postone, Concrete and Abstract Time. I'm always a bit skeptical when people want to draw a line and just say, that's not really how history works. Okay, 12. So,
as usual, fate depends on whether or not commodity production is abolished.
Sure, yeah. 13. I'm not gonna get into that. 13. In sum, the principle governing commodity production was not grasped. Chinese economists are Marxist-Leninists as far as book learning goes, but when they encounter economic practice, Marxist-Leninism gets shortchanged. Their thinking is confused. If we make mistakes, we will lead the peasantry to the enemy side. What are the proletariat and its party to do in country?
That's a perfect commentary on Trumpism and the Democrat Party, right?
You could also connect the 18th Brumaire here with to plug in the Marxist text.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a good one for the. What does he say? There's this big debate on whether Marx really said like the peasants stupid as potatoes or something, or bags of potatoes.
He doesn't call them stupid. He said like at the point of which like the Society of December 10th, I think, or December 2nd, which is Louis Bonaparte's coalition of all the different fragments of society. Basically under that shape or under the rule of Napoleon, they were like just them as a whole. There wasn't really a coherent thing. It was just a collection of potatoes. So it's essentially there wasn't really an organic shape that unified the peasants because they weren't social. At least in Marxist view, they weren't socialized in the way that the proletariat were. And you have like the substanceless proletariat and the social production. That seems to be the basis of his remark there. Is that it was just kind of an amalgam of things given the promise of the Bonapartist promise promises of using state power to, like, for instance, get the gold from California and all these other things that were going on. But so I don't know if that's in his, how much something like that is in his mind right here, but it's definitely true that the peasants could easily back a Bonapartist figure. And history definitely plays that out over and over again. You can just look back to the USSR and kind of the inability of Lenin and the early Bolsheviks to deal with the peasants, having to then, like, after the, whatever the name was, the treaty, that they lost a bunch of land, and eventually having to go to the new economic policy, and things just kind of an upheaval from there. So, I mean, like, whatever you think about the peasants in general, this point is right. You can't forget about the peasants. And I do think that Mao sides a little bit more with the peasants, because I think it's at the beginning of this essay, he talks about Stalin's mistake was to distrust the peasants. I don't really know what I make of that, but there's at least pointing out the connection.
Yeah, well, I think Mao was the one who most effectively, mobilized the peasants toward a revolutionary end, which was obviously hugely influential. And here we see, he's describing, his method as being on, erring on the side of Lenin rather than Stalin, in terms of Lenin saying, small and medium individual producers should be gradually united in productive producers cooperatives, right? It was the Great Leap Forward. There was a lot of communization of agriculture. Industry should be developed to the utmost, and the collective farm should be placed on the modern technical basis of large-scale production, not expropriating them, but on the contrary, generously supplying them with first-class tractors and other machines. So it's a gradual transitional program based on the communization of agriculture, and he's attributing this also to Lenin, right? So maybe we can move over to 19. There can be no doubt. We say, so this is a quote from Stalin. Case of all capital, more or less. Yeah. Okay. So again, just further affirmation. Let's see.
I'm just gonna write down here. Conrad said the same thing, also. Should I read it so our audience knows what we're discussing?
Yeah, sure. Read that. You can read 20 if you want. Just read them. I would say we just read Mao's commentary.
Yeah, just Mao's commentary?
Yeah, I would just go for Mao's commentary.
Okay. So he says, this statement's a little exaggerated, but it is true that commodity production was not a capitalist institution exclusively. The second plenary session of the Central Committee suggested policies of utilizing, restricting, and transforming commodity production. This condition is fully operative in China. This point is entirely correct. We no longer have such circumstances and conditions. There are those who fear commodities. Without exception, they fear capitalism, not realizing that with the elimination of capitalists, it is allowable to expand commodity production vastly. We are still backward in commodity production, behind Brazil and India. Commodity production, not anymore. Commodity production is not an isolated thing. Look at the context, capitalism or socialism. In a capitalist context, it is a capitalist commodity production. In a socialist context, it is a socialist commodity production. Commodity production, as you said, Conrad, earlier, has existed since ancient times. Buying and selling began in what history calls the Shang dynasty, the commerce dynasty. The last king of the Shang dynasty, Shao, was competent in civil and military matters, but he was turned into a villain along with the first emperor of the Qin and Cao Cao. This is wrong. Better to have no books than complete faith in them. Another callback, right? In capitalist society, there are no socialist institutions considered as social institutions, but the working class and socialist ideology do exist in capitalist society. The thing that determines commodity production is the surrounding economic conditions. The question is, can commodity production be regarded as a useful instrument for furthering socialist production? I think commodity production will serve socialism quite tamely. This can be discussed among the cadres.
Yeah, so these are interesting points. So his point is actually like that, in the stage of socialism or whatever that China's in, that the leaps forth made, in the context of collective industrialization, right, can enable, right, the diffusion of large amounts of commodities that can be exchanged within a commodity market that's enabled. Right. So again, again, like, you know, again, going back to the connection with Deng, like you really do see it here, right? In terms of what later happens. And I think that, you know, Western Marxists who say like, you know, Mao good, Deng bad, you know, really haven't read too carefully what Mao actually wrote, right? Because like, you know, I honestly, you know, I'm not necessarily persuaded at all that had Mao continued to lead for like 20 years after he did, that he would have went as far as Deng did. I think that's very doubtful. But I certainly think that, regardless, you know, even the people Mao appointed as the successor, like Hu Gaofeng, I mean, they were going to some extent in the same direction, right? So I suspect this happens as a consequence of the internal recognition of Soviet failures, which, you know, the Soviet system did not address itself, but also just because of the hollowing out of the bureaucracy that occurred with the Cultural Revolution, right? And the need to kind of get a fresh start in certain economic fields, right?
Right.
So what do we got here? We got so let's go over to 22. So he just makes a remark here about how he quotes from Stalin, and he says basically the Chinese peasants haven't got as far toward collective farm production, right? And this will be addressed obviously in the Great Leap Forward, however. And by the way, communization of peasant production occurred extensively in the Great Leap Forward. But then after Deng took power, the decommunization was largely. But it's still complicated because I think like in the country, I think like land is all technically publicly owned, right? So there's still aspects of what happened. Like the farmers work independently, but they're sort of like granted access to the land, right? So if you move to a city, for example, you lose rights to the land, right? Because there's no absentee landowning in the country. So you still see elements of the structure which survive. Okay, so let's go over to 23. How the two basic forms of ownership will ultimately become one is a special question which requires separate discussion. So again, he says Stalin's avoiding the issue, having failed to find a method or suitable formulation on the transition from collective to public ownership. So here where you get this thing about mass democracy, like, you know, like Stalin saying, oh, well, we're going to have publicly owned production, which I think, you know, Mao calls collective production, and collective farm production, which cannot be said to be publicly owned. What Mao was saying is that neither of those things in themselves are going to lead to, you know, what does he describe it here as? Are going to lead to a full system of public ownership, right? And, you know, so it's the Cultural Revolution, you know, as this sort of hyper-voluntarist, you know, kind of event, intervenes into this problematic, right, we can say. Okay, 24. So our commodity production is not an ordinary type. So let me read this. So the quote, consequently, our commodity production is not of the ordinary type, but is a special kind of commodity production. Commodity production without, this is from Stalin, by the way, commodity production without capitalists, which is concerned mainly with the goods of associated socialist producers, the state, the collective farms, the cooperatives, the sphere of action of which is confined to items of personal consumptions, which obviously cannot possibly develop into capitalist production, and which, together with its money economy, is designed to serve the development and consolidation of socialist production. So Mao writes, the sphere of action is not limited to items of individual consumption. Some means of production have to be classed as commodities. If agricultural output consists of commodities but industrial output does not, then how is exchange to be carried out? If our country is changed to China, this paragraph becomes all the more interesting to read. In China, not only consumer goods, but the agricultural means of production have to be supplied. Stalin never sold the means of production to the peasants. Khrushchev changed that. Let's not confuse the problem of the dividing line between socialism and communism with the problem of the dividing line between collective and public ownership. The collective ownership system leaves us with the problem of commodity production, the goal of which is consolidating the worker-peasant alliance and developing production. Today, there are those who say that communism of the peasants is glorious. After one trip to the rural areas, they think the peasantry is simply wonderful, that they are about to enter paradise, that they are better than the workers. This is the surface phenomenon. We shall have to see if the peasants really have a communist spirit, and more than that, we shall have to examine the commune ownership system, including the extent to which the means of production and subsistence belong to communal collective ownership. As the county party committee secretary of Hisuu, Hanan, says, we still have to develop commodity production and not charge blindly ahead, right? So again, what Mao's saying here is that it's not even like Stalin restricts his application of commodity production to objects of personal consumption. But Mao is also saying that this isn't such a great definition for a range of reasons, right? One of which is that, the means of production, that are used by agricultural workers, for example, they're not necessarily going to be public, right? So also,
Right.
like, what is a means of production? What do we call a means of production, right? So yeah, if it's like a large scale factory, in Shanghai or something, yeah, then, we could say, well, it's owned by the government, right? It's collectively owned. But in some cases, commodity production, the means of production themselves will have to be commodified, right? And he points out that this already happened to some degree with Khrushchev, right? Okay, so we look at 25.
Mhm.
Yeah, so this is interesting, 25. So Stalin here suggests that, Marx's categories in Capital won't necessarily would be somewhat artificial if applied to socialist relations, because of the way that socialist economies are quite different. He writes, it is quite strange, to say the least, to use these concepts now, when the working class is not only not bereft of our power and means of production, but on the contrary, is in possession of the power and control of the means of production. Talk of labor power being a commodity and of hiring workers sounds rather absurd now under a system, as though the working class, which possesses means of production, hires itself and sells its labor power to itself. This is, so especially after the so Mao writes, the labor power question is not resolved until labor power is no longer a commodity. So I think Mao's adding a caveat here, because he's saying, like, if we look at, all of China, all of the USSR, I mean, it's interesting, like, it's a bit of a different interpretation of Marx, because if you look at Marx, this is like, Marx just differentiates between productive and unproductive labor in Capital. So, like, productive labor is necessarily labor that's done in beholden to capital, or it's necessarily labor that's set on by capital. So if you pay someone out of revenue for a public company, that's not productive labor, right? For Marx, which sort of is challenging towards kind of like attempts by Trotskyists, for example, to talk about state capitalism, right? Because it would seem to suggest that he's saying that that's not exactly capitalist production. Of course, he acknowledges that even in capitalist society, that's necessary, but as a complement, right, to the predominance of surplus value production. Here, Mao seems to be challenging Stalin a little bit, if I understand properly, because Stalin is saying, like, well, it's silly to say, like, that labor is a commodity, labor power is a commodity. If if you have public enterprises, right, that are just like paying people, right? And I think what Mao's saying by contrast, right, is he's saying that as long as there's like a value assigned to labor power, that we have to say it's still a commodity, right? So it's a really interesting. Already you see, like, again, you see Mao saying, like, kind of like stepping back from Stalin. He's like, whoa, like, you're going a bit fast, like, in the way you're talking about society. Like you're making it out like you've accomplished more than you maybe have, right? And Deng goes even further in that direction in a way, right? Because Deng, he's like, no, fuck, like, we're not going to get. Deng's like, not till 2050. We've just got to build up means of production. Have this sort of sort of Fordist style state, and then get to the point where the means of production are developed enough that we can really transform the relations of production. So again, I think it's quite a fundamental. You got to understand this. Like, you have the Soviet Union that kind of charges, I think, blindly ahead in some ways in terms of the model they have. China is where this stuff is criticized, right?
Yeah.
And where new approaches are experimented with. And I would argue that's why China still exists. Now, I'm not saying everything that was done was good, right? But it's the ability. So Mao always says, like, it's like I said, it was a culture of self-criticism, experiment, self-criticize, experiment, self-criticize. That turns out to be really important.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that it doesn't just calcify into this, kind of single-minded bureaucracy, So let's move over to 26. Stalin says the law of value exists under the socialist system. Mao says it it doesn't have a regulative function. I don't know if that's tantamount to saying that it doesn't exist, but Mao says it doesn't have a regulative function.
I think. Go ahead, Conrad.
And by the way, the law of value, just for those who don't know, the law of value is like the basic equivocity in the values of goods, which is established. And usually we say that the law of value wasn't established until capitalism, but it may be more accurate to say that it wasn't generalized until capitalism.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you'd have to say that historically laws of value would have crept up within certain regions, but that you wouldn't have had like a continent, right? That was, but of course we see today, like the values of things in China are different than the States. So they're correspondent in some sense, but they're not equivocal, right? So even today, you know, this is one thing I don't like about this whole, like I said, this whole like there was nothing, then there was capitalism. It's like, wait, because lots of people's labor isn't waged today, right? Like nature is treated as an economic externality. Like you need externality in capitalism, right? And the goods in China aren't the same price as goods in the States. So capitalism is never finished. Capitalism cannot finish, right? If capitalism were to self-actualize, it would implode immediately, right? It always has to be held back, right? There has to be redistribution. There has to be externalities, like for use value appropriation, you know, unwaged domestic labor, nature, you know, modern day forms of slavery and so forth. You know, you know, there also has to be discrepancies, right? You know, between the way the law of value applies, right? In order to permit, for example, like the procuration of cheap labor from poor countries, which, you know, keeps the rate of profit up, right? So it's all, you know, you have to have, I'm saying capitalism can't actually self-actualize as a structure in some linear way, right?
Yeah.
You know, one thing that came to my mind here, that it not being a regulative function, is that he's the way that I'm taking this is that he's not posing it as something external that's relating to things. Of that, like the law is. I think Mao is probably is better on this than is more right than Stalin on this point, because the law here, if you're going to talk about it, is an abstraction of something that's going on, not something that you know exists out there that somehow, you know, prevent. Like the law of gravity is not because there's a big book out there that says here are the Platonist laws for how gravity works. It's this is what's happening, and when we abstract it, we get the formulas and stuff like that. And it is, of course, heuristic, because like that's if it wasn't, then there would be no need to go beyond the first person who said it, because they either got it or they didn't. But the one thing that I was wondering if you could maybe speak to, Conrad, which is the voluntarist versus economicist debate that kind of happened between Mao and Stalin, because I think you can kind of point to something here, like this one and the previous one, of a certain teleology versus it's not an ungiven teleology, or like the possibility but without guarantee.
Well, obviously Mao recognized that in capitalism there are, you know, economic laws which exist, right? You know, I think he saw them as mutable in a lot of cases, but I think that you know, I think that what Mao sees is that, you know, I think his problem with Stalin is the way that he doesn't see the sort of trajectory that Stalin's pursuing as terminating necessarily in the construction of something like, you know, a bona fide communist society, right? So he's like, okay, you know, he's like, you have national control, right, of large sectors of the economy, right? There are large sectors of the economy which aren't, you know, sensitively managed with respect to the needs of the local population, you know, on that basis. But like, where does this go? Right. And I think it's this frustration. So again, I wouldn't describe it as just a voluntarist debate. I think like what happens is that Mao is kind of like searching for a way, because he recognizes the objectivity of these patterns, but he's searching for a way to expediently get beyond the problem. And he resorts to hyper-voluntarism as a way to get beyond it. Right. Okay. Kind of like a frustrated impasse, you know, if we're talking about, you know, this period of the Great Leap Forward and especially the Cultural Revolution. Was the Cultural Revolution an abject failure? You know, it's complicated. You know, education, access to primary education was greatly expanded in that period, even as secondary education was often shut down. You know, local democracy in China, which still exists and is very robust, was established in the Cultural Revolution for the first time because of people's organic uprisings. But what the Cultural Revolution failed to do is it failed to chart a path to actually overcoming, you know, to seeing how we could build, like how do we get to a communism without it becoming Stalinism, right? And I think again, it's this frustration. So I think what Deng Xiaoping does is he draws more orthodox conclusions, right? From this failure of Mao, right? And he kind of like, and Deng's not like he's not like I know the exact solution. He's like, but look, means of production, right? And the path will reveal itself, when it needs to be seen. Well, look, obviously there's a problem with this too, isn't there? Because it risks being a kind of like, depoliticization that, in which the possibility of some kind of transition slips through your fingers. And I think the great debate in China now, is will China just edge more and more towards being a capitalist country? Though we should note that this has, it really hasn't continued in this direction for the past 15 years or so, right? The private sector hasn't become more empowered or expanded. But will China drift more and more towards being a capitalist country? Or will China, in light of, the substantial failures of the West, especially recently, 2007, 2008, COVID and so forth, will it just say, this isn't a model worth emulating? And with issues like a global environmental threat, right? It's not even clear it can emulate the model of the West with destroying the entire world, right? And obviously environmental stewardship is going to require way more, sort of collective level projects, right? Centrally administered projects. So I think in China, that's actually the political debate that's sort of prevailing right now. And I think Samir Amin is very correct to say it could go, in either direction at this point, right? I mean, what do you say about Xi? He's clearly to the left of Deng. He's clearly to the right of Mao, right? So there's some sort of, ambiguity there. But we'll get to the last point. I see some of our audience is logging off. Point 27. True, the law of value has no regulating function in our socialist production. Yeah, so he says, in our society, the law of value has no regulative function, that is, has no determinative function. Planning determines production. E.g., for pigs or steel, we do not use the law of value, we rely on planning. So, it's oversimplistic, I think, to say planning does it. You have to say the law of value if you have commodity production as some kind of purchase in the situation. But I think it's, the point here, is if the law of value regulates all production, right? It's like even public infrastructure isn't created in conformance to the law of value, right? There's you're kind of stepping outside of that, right? Environmental projects and all this. So it's very important, in China, it's always been treated as very important. However relatively large the market was in the communist era, it was always treated as important to maintain the flexibility to step beyond the exigencies imposed, or, the directives of the law of value, and to be able to have a sort of planning that could occur, which we still see because the country's still organized based on 5-year plans. And so there you go. That's our reading group for today. A little longer than usual, but I think we had nice. It was nice to go through that. So for the next week, we'll be finishing this book on Practice and Contradiction by Mao Zedong, published by Verso, 2007. And we'll be discussing 3 essays next week on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, where do correct ideas come from, and talk on the questions of philosophy. And then after that, we'll be moving over and we'll be starting to read the selected works of Deng Xiaoping, which is going to take us more time because I don't have a really distilled, not because Deng Xiaoping is so much greater than Mao, but just because I don't have a distilled volume, so I have more to go through. So I think what we'll do with the Deng thing is he's got 3 volumes of selected works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through 1/3 of each volume before we do our group. And then I'm going to pick out some essays. I'm not going to give it all to you, but I'm going to pick out essays I like, and then we can do that ones which are interesting. Okay. Good.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in today. The audience today was really great, very engaged.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, very, very good questions about that's the kind of stuff we like, about questions about commodity production and stuff like that. I like this. The season the means of production will only bring about a 2-class system of commie chads overseeing breadline wage cuck.
Hey, nice profile picture too.
Oh yeah, what do we got here? Oh, yeah, very good. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. Wonderful. Strange world. Okay, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. And I'll talk to you guys just for a minute after. Let's stay on. Ender Wiggin says, bring back the Drip Lord. Rosenstock promises he will be back. I think Rosenstock's really itching to read some Xi. So I think
I'm sure.
I think he might come back for the Xi. I think he's like, take a little time out for the Mao, but we'll see. But he's a little busy now, but he does want to come back. We know he's very well loved in the group because he won the poll.
Yeah. He's working on his book, so yeah, right.
His book is done.
Some space. Okay. I'm just trying to be polite.
I have to write a review of it at some point. Okay, guys, this has been the Chinese Marxism reading group with Conrad Hamilton, Ernesto Vargas, and Timothy Shates for Zero Books Capital Comrades. If you want to join our group, just search on Facebook, Zero Books Capital Comrades. That's capital with a K and comrades with a K. Thank you guys, and have a great Sunday.